Tonight, let me take you gently beneath the waves for a long, slow journey, a bedtime tale inspired by a famous voyage under the sea. Imagine darkness settled across your room like a soft blanket. Breathe in slowly, then exhale. Feel the steady rhythm of the ocean in your chest as you settle into the story. Once upon a time, and in a way that could be true anywhere the sea touches the shore, there came to the world a mystery that pricked the curiosity of sailors and scholars alike, men and women who sailed for trade, for travel. For the simple love of the open water spoke of a thing that glided along the sea as if it belonged to both water and imagination. It flashed with light, moved with speed, and left mariners wondering whether the world under the waves was more unknown and larger than anyone had ever guessed. The story you will hear tonight moves slow and wide, like the tide. It follows three companions, a thoughtful scholar, his quiet and steady helper, and a skilled harpooner of quick hands. They live in a world of careful reasoning and practiced routine, yet they are not strangers to the strange. When a government offered the scholar a chance to join a grand chase, a quest to follow an extraordinary creature suspected to be more than a beast, more than a machine, he said yes at once. He could not resist the call of the unknown. Alongside him came his faithful servant, who spoke little and moved calmly, steady as tide-worn rope. And there was the harpooner, a man of action and habit, whose hands told more of him than words. The ship that took them to sea was a large and resolute vessel. For many long days, the crew searched the great blue, watching the horizon, scanning the surface where sky and water met. They chased glimpses, followed phosphorescent wakes, and listened for breathing that sounded like steam from an engine. Their search threaded them through patterns of weather and light, the hush of dawn, the glitter of noon, the hush of night, and the electric flash that would suddenly paint the waters with luminous bands. They followed the trail of an impossible thing that left captains and constellations equally puzzled. Imagine the sea beneath you, dark and profound. In it moves a shape unlike any whale, smooth and shelled, shining with a strange internal light. It rides below like a silent steed, slipping beneath the waves, touching the surface only to make a ring of living light. One night, under a sky freckled with stars, the scholars and sailors watched it wheel and circle their ship, then withdraw and charge with a speed their engines could not match. The harpooner leapt for the chase, and in the flash and thunder of sudden waters, the strange thing struck the ship, and the scholar fell into the sea. For a while, the sea held him in its cool, rocking arms. He swam and he struggled, and in the waves, hope came softly, a hand, a voice, a familiar shoulder. It was his companion, steady and sure. And soon the harpooner, too, had found him, brave and beating with wild intensity against the water. And beneath them lay the body of the impossible thing. Up close, it was not a whale at all. It was iron and plate, joint and rivet, a vessel of the deep, living in the sea as surely as fish, and carrying within it a world of its own. The scholar and his two friends were pulled into the belly of this vessel, by men who wore strange masks and moved with silent purpose. They were hastily brought inside and gently and firmly closed in. For a while they were afraid, and then astonishment took the place of fear. The interior was lighted by a glow like moonlight, but steady and steadying. A small table, a few chairs, a lamp, comforts lived there. And beyond the main room, other wonders. The captain of this vessel had a look about him that was calm and grave. He wore his strength and sorrow like armor. He listened to the three travelers' story. When he spoke, his voice was even and sure, and he explained with patient words what had happened. He could not risk sending them back to the world. He would not throw them into the deep. There must be quiet and order on his ship, and for reasons all his own, he took them in. He gave them food. He showed them a great library, filled with books from many lands. He showed them a museum of shells and corals and carvings, treasures he had gathered in his long life under the sea. It was not the first time he had scoured such deep places. He loved the ocean. He called it the living infinite and spoke of its calm and its secrets with the tenderness of one who has found refuge there. The scholar was a man of questions. He could not resist turning each new discovery over, feeling its weight like a smooth pebble pulled from the sand. So the captain gave them freedom within certain bounds. Not liberty to go ashore as they pleased, but openness within the vessel. Rooms to sleep in, foods to try, and at times, in careful moments chosen by their captain, an invitation to walk upon the sea itself. Yes, walk, but in a different way. Imagine being clothed in a suit that holds your breath safe, like a small, friendly world on your back. Imagine a copper helmet, like a little planet around your head, and a light that your hand could hold like a tame star. The captain called this invention a way to see the bottom of the ocean with your feet on the sand, to step through forests of seaweed, and to watch creatures glow as the sun finds them through thick water. So the scholar, his servant, and the harpooner were led out through a hatch and into a world beneath the waves. The water above them, pressed and thrummed and strange, felt to them like a denser sky. The sand beneath their feet was pale and soft. They walked under a gentle blue light that fell as if through a curtain of glass. Sea forests rose like strange, slow trees whose fronds streamed upward as if seeking the sun. The colors were odd and deep, purples and melted emeralds, and long filaments that shivered when a small fish darted by. They saw creatures like flowers that retreated into stone if touched, shells that shone like little moons, and coral banks where whole worlds of tiny animals grew. They walked and rested in such calm places, and the scholar learned more than pages could hold. He saw how life found shapes and balance even where pressure grew cruel and light moved strange. He found a strange delight in the hush and the kindness of this captain's world, for it was a quiet far different from any harbor. The captain shared with them stories day by day of lost islands and dazzling reefs, of shipwrecks far older than maps, and of tunnels under the earth where the sea runs under the land, taught them that electricity, that bright and obedient force, could be made from the sea itself, and that it could be used to make lamps to light the deepest nights, to drive a great screw that cut the sea like a keel through the thick water, and to keep the caves warm and the pantry full. He showed his library not only books, but shells larger than heads, corals of impossible patterns, paintings, and carved things from many continents. For he had traveled the depths and gathered what the surface had forgotten. There was a sadness in him too. In a quiet, honest moment, he confessed that he had once been a man of the land, proud, wounded, and full of pain. The news of losses and cruelties had driven him below the waves and out beyond the laws men agreed upon. He had chosen to make a world beneath the water, and in this world he lived free, set apart, a craftsman of solitude. He promised the scholar comfort if they accepted the conditions of their new life. And in point of fact, the scholar in himself, curious almost to a fault, chose to stay a while. The servant followed where his master chose to go. The harpooner, always restless, stayed as well, for the sea still called to him with its hunting and its wild surprises. The captain took them to places that stretched the imagination. He opened windows in the hull, so the saloon filled with a liquid lantern glow, and the moving shapes of fish and flowing gardens of plant life became the world outside their windows. They walked along in forests of kelp and found grottos where the walls hummed with tiny creatures. They learned of coral islands that grow slowly in rings until a lagoon forms, and how the tireless work of tiny animals had, in some times, created whole islands. They sailed among islands shaped by time and fire and water, and visited places where old voyagers' ships lay buried, their iron fossilized, and their decks sheltering the sea's creatures. Some nights, the captain led them to the great cold places, where ice fields stretch like white deserts, and the sea hides far older, darker worlds beneath it. They rose and fell to depths where pressure would have been an undoing for ordinary bones, and yet they found steel and craft, and a captain with a heart for the unseen. On one of those nights, in the quiet of a floating blue, they came upon an enormous beast of the deep, a monster of many arms and ancient hunger. It wrapped its tentacles round the side and pulled hard. The crew fought back with axes, and brave hands, a friend of theirs, was lost. It was a sobering, terrible thing, a reminder that the sea is tender and beautiful, and also full of fierce need. Afterwards, the captain mourned and set stones of memory where they buried the dead on the bottom, among corals that would one day flourish into a garden of memory. Time on the Nautilus held a slow and steady pulse, days stitched together by light, food, work, reading, and the strange arts of making electricity from the sea. The captain spoke of currents like great rivers, of the Gulf Stream that runs warm and fast and shapes weather and wanderers alike, of banks thick with seaweed where things gathered like a heap of drifted leaves, and of undersea valleys that hold the quiet rest of many a wreck. More than once, the captain showed how the Nautilus could sink deep to escape storms that swelled the surface, or could rise like a sleeping whale to breathe beneath the sky. Once, in a place where the world was lit entirely by the sea's own glow, the captain steered them into a cradle of blue light so intense the sky seemed nothing but water and stars. The scholar learned how to measure depth and how pressure multiplies on the living body, how the deeper you go, the harder the world presses in, and learned, too, to be amazed at the ingenuity of human hands that dare master so much. And at one time, they practiced a strange, ancient art of harvesting. Pearls from clams, shells like secret jewels that lie in the crook of rough shells. The captain showed how life sometimes encases itself in beauty when a little irritant presses on the soft creature. A pearl would grow, layer by slow layer, guarded by the slow, patient labor of the sea. For months, the Nautilus roamed, tropical lights that shimmer like lanterns in a blue dusk, coral plains that look like gardens of glass, islands risen from the quiet where the sea had served as a maker of land. They passed along the coasts of continents and around secret atolls made by polyps smaller than a pinhead, all working together to raise a ring of land. They traveled so long it felt as though they followed the hidden spine of the globe. Now under the warm, bright Pacific, now through a strait where red water steamed from a fire under the waves, and once to the very hollow of a mountain where iron and coal lay like a treasure, the captain's own private coal mines under the sea. There was a calm humanity to these discoveries. The captain used the sea's gifts to light his lamps and power his machines. He made a museum for wonders, and he fed his men with food carved from the ocean itself. He let his passengers breathe and learn and walk on the bottom of the sea. The scholar kept notes and charts. The servant did chores and kept everything tidy and in order. The harpooner watched the horizon, yearned for the chase, and sometimes found meat and the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. The days were soft and steady, though not without sorrow. They passed the shores where once brave ships bearing great treasures had sunk in battle. The captain moved among these places with a quiet reverence and sometimes a fierce determination. He had a way of deciding in silence and then following a plan with the calm force of someone who had made choices that far outlasted common arguments. The three travelers came now to an ocean of slow tides and floating weeds, a place where currents circle and float like a quiet inland sea. There the scholar noticed driftwood from far-off forests and dead things wrapped in creeper roots that the ocean kept safe as if in a long pocket. It was a place where the sea collects the things it cannot give back. The captain spoke about this place like a farmer describing a field, as though all this floating tangle was part garden and part granary. And he spoke too of how nature makes its stores where human hands cannot touch them. They tasted what the sea gave, the strange milk of a whale, sweet as some milks of beasts on land, and learned how the ocean made food where land could not. They visited caverns lit by their lamps, where pearls larger than a man's hand rested in a giant clam like a hidden sun. They watched craters of fire under the deep and navigated long tunnels the sea had bored under the land. Once in a far southern reach of the world, they climbed to a volcanic peak and looked over a buried city of stone fallen columns and the ghostly rise of old temples besprinkled with coral and living things gathered there like ornaments. The scholar stood still and thought of the thousands of years that had passed since men walked those streets. A continent vanished into the deep. The captain wrote Atlantis on a small stone and placed it in a quiet alcove of his memory. For a long while they sailed where the cold pushed great bergs, and the sea turned like a wheel, and the ship had to find its way through iced canyons. The Nautilus rose and sank like the breath of some sleeping giant. At times, the scholar felt small, and at other times hushed and bigger than at any book he'd ever read. One morning, there came a day under the pearled sky of the far south when the captain said simply, "Let us go to the very pole." He believed the sea might still be open there in a way men had not yet fully understood. So they set their course toward the point where all lines of the compass meet. Imagine that, steering to the center of all the world's meridians, to that white point where day and night fold into a long notch of sky. They walked on the polar shore and waited for the sun to dip exactly at noon so they could say without doubt, "This is the pole." The wind carried their flags, a simple black flag with a single letter. And with a soft ceremony, the captain set it down and said to the empty air he believed had hurt him long ago, "Farewell." But in the end, the sea holds both tenderness and cold, and in the midst of travel and discovery, danger would find them again. Ice that overturned, shoving its bulk against the sea's full force. They were trapped under a mountain of shifting crystal for a time, and all their contraptions and all their wits were needed to warm the water and stave off freezing. This took all hours and all strength and a great heroism of small things, warm engines humming, men taking turns at hard labor, and a steady heart refusing panic. They were freed by a mixture of care and courage, and the kind of grit that people have when they refuse to give up. The journey home, or the next leg of the voyage, crossed seas where currents run like rivers, and where heat meets cold and storms brew like quick-tempered beasts. In one place, they found the tangled remains of a telegraph cable that once stitched America to Europe with flashes of thought. In another, a ship long sunk lay now like a fossil, an old warship, its timbers and broadside no longer a shield, but a reef for fish and a bed for small coral. Once when the sea was bright and the lights leaned silver on its skin, a man-o-war appeared not far away in the wet dawn. Cannon roared and shots skipped like stones. The Nautilus was not a garden boat. It was a machine steered by a man who had his own law. The captain's grief, once hidden, flared like an old wound. Some ships, some nations, had been the cause of the hurt that had driven him below the waves. He had been set upon by violence and sorrow, and the sea had become, for him, a place to answer. The scholar watched a terrible scene. The captain guiding his vessel with a calm and dreadful resolve. The ocean opened to swallow a great ship and its crew. The captain stood with sadness and fury braided together like rope. He later came to the scholar and set a final thing in his hands, a manuscript of his knowledge, notes, and curious facts, to be launched into the sea should the last days come. He asked the scholar to keep the book safe. The scholar took the gift, feeling the heavy truth that knowledge itself might be all that would remain. Years later, after perils and lightning, and a whirl of ice that took them down and spit them out, a storm that tossed like a god's breath, the scholar awoke in a fisher's hut far from the shock and crush of the deep. He was in good hands. His two friends were near. They smiled with salt-scraped faces and the relief of people who had kept one another alive. The captain, where had he gone? The Nautilus, did it survive? That part of the tale rests partly with the sea. Some things the sea keeps well, and some things it gives away again, like shells to the shore. All the scholar could do from the safety of that warm hut was to tell the tale. The world he returned to would be the world of bright lamps and coffee houses and scholars and shouted arguments. But inside his chest, he would carry the hush of the sea and a long list of wonders. There would always be questions that never found perfect answers. Who was the captain in his birth and in his sorrow? What wrongs had been done to make a man seek refuge forever where the tides make music? The answers never came in full. The sailor in the scholar's story had a name only in the carved letter on the ship's belongings, a single initial that suggested several possibilities and nothing at all. In the end, the lesson the scholar kept was one of both awe and caution. The sea is vast and nourishing and generous, a place of light and music and gardens. It is also fierce and immediate and final. Some of its most beautiful things are made slowly, bead by tiny bead. Pearls grow like patience. Corals make islands like a long argument of tiny lives climbing on each other's backs. And finally, two little things are worth holding on to when sleep comes, or when any worry rustles at your window. First, curiosity is a good companion, full of wonder, but it must be held with kindness and care. Second, the company you keep, calm, steady, brave, is a safer raft than any craft of iron alone. Now, put your hands by your side and feel the quiet of night like a long, slow wave coming close. You have traveled with 3 friends across vast, unknown places. You have seen starry oceans, glowing gardens of coral, caves of light, machines that live, and the great hush of being small and alive in an immense world. Let those images dissolve softly. The captain's lantern is dimming. The Nautilus glides away under the slow gloss of the moon. Your breath comes gently, let it steady. Each inhale is like a tiny dive, each exhale a soft surfacing. As you lie quiet, think of the sea's rhythm, slow and patient. You are safe. Your breath is steady. If you like, imagine the hush of a small library on board that gentle, strange vessel. Books stacked, sea glass shining, a warm cup on the table. a gifted manuscript waiting for a reader years from now. Listen to the slow, sure sound of your own breathing and let the last glimmer fade. There will always be wonders to find in the world, on the land, in the sky, and beneath the waves. Close your eyes now and drift toward the soft, full quiet of sleep. Your own ocean waits, slow and safe. Sleep well. Good night.